You didn't spend recklessly this year. You didn't make any big financial mistakes. You didn't buy things you couldn't afford. You didn't ignore your bills. You didn't blow your savings on something foolish. And yet, somehow, your money feels like it's doing less than it used to. The groceries cost more than they did last year. The rent went up. The same paycheck that used to feel like enough now disappears a little faster than it should. And when you check your savings account, the one you've been adding to consistently, the one you've been responsible about, it doesn't feel like it's growing the way it should. You did everything right. So why does it still feel like you're falling behind? Here's the answer most people never get. There is a force working on your money right now. Quietly. Constantly. Without sending you a bill or asking your permission. It doesn't care how disciplined you are. It doesn't care how carefully you budget. It works on everyone's money, all the time, whether they understand it or not. It has a name. And once you understand what it actually does, not in theory, not in an economics textbook, but in your real everyday life, you will never look at your savings the same way again. That force is inflation. And before you tune out, because you've heard that word before, and it's always felt like something that happens to other people or shows up in news headlines that don't quite apply to you, stay with this for a moment. Because inflation is not abstract. You have already felt it. You felt it the last time you went to the grocery store and noticed that the same items in your cart cost noticeably more than they did a year ago. You felt it when your rent renewal came in higher than the year before. You felt it when a dinner out, a tank of gas, a basic repair, a flight, a doctor's visit, all of it, quietly became more expensive without anyone asking whether that was okay with you. That is inflation. Not a chart, not a percentage, a feeling. The feeling that the same amount of money buys a little less than it used to. And here is what makes it so easy to miss for so long. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly. A few percent here, a few percent there. Small enough in any given month that it blends into the background noise of everyday life. But over a year, it adds up. Over 5 years, it compounds. Over a decade, it can quietly reshape what your savings are actually worth in ways that most people never stop to calculate. Think about it this way. Imagine you have $1,000 today. You put it somewhere safe. You don't touch it. A year from now, you still have $1,000. The number hasn't changed, but if inflation ran at 4% that year, your $1,000 can now only buy what $960 could buy before. You didn't spend anything. You didn't lose anything on paper. But in terms of what that money can actually do for you, what it can purchase, what it can cover, what it's worth in the real world, it shrank. That is what people mean when they talk about purchasing power. And purchasing power is really the only thing that matters. Because money is not valuable because of the number printed on it. Money is valuable because of what it can do, what it can buy, what options it gives you, what problems it can solve. And when inflation is quietly reducing what your money can do, year after year in the background, without any announcement, the number in your account can stay exactly the same while the reality of your financial position slowly gets smaller. This is the invisible tax. Nobody voted for it. Nobody sends you a bill for it. There is no line on your paycheck that says, inflation deducted. It just happens. And most people go years without fully connecting the dots between that force and the quiet frustration they feel when their savings never seem to stretch as far as they expected. Now, here is where it gets personal. Most people, when they decide to be responsible with money, do the same thing. They open a savings account. They add to it regularly. They leave it alone. And they feel good about that, because they should. A savings account is a responsible choice. It is a real step. It matters. But here is what most savings accounts will not tell you on the front page. The interest rate they pay you is often lower than the rate of inflation, which means that in practical terms, money sitting in a standard savings account can actually lose ground over time. Not because the bank took it, not because you spent it, but because inflation is moving faster than the interest the account is earning. The gap between those two numbers, what inflation takes and what your savings account gives back, is a quiet leak. small in any given month, significant over years. You are doing the responsible thing, and the system just never quite explained the full picture. So, what does that mean over time? Let's stay with that same $1,000. If inflation averages 3% per year for 10 years, and your savings account earns 1% per year, you end up with a number that looks bigger on paper. But in terms of what that money can actually buy, in terms of its real value, it has lost meaningful ground. The gap between what inflation took and what the account returned quietly eroded the purchasing power of every dollar you set aside. This is not to frighten you. This is to make invisible math visible. Because the cost of not understanding this isn't dramatic. It doesn't show up as a crisis. It shows up as a slow drift. A gradual feeling that your savings never quite seem to be doing what you expected them to do. A quiet suspicion that despite doing everything right, you're still somehow behind. That feeling is real. And now you know why. So what do people who understand this do differently? They don't panic. They don't make dramatic moves. They don't take on risk. They don't understand or chase returns that sound too good to be true. They simply start to think about money in terms of what it can do, not just what it says on a screen. They understand that the goal of saving is not just to accumulate a number. The goal is to preserve and grow purchasing power over time. And that requires money to be doing something, not sitting completely still. For many people, this is where the idea of investing starts to make sense. Not as something complicated, not as something reserved for people who understand markets, but as a practical response to a simple problem. If inflation is quietly reducing what your money can do, then your money needs to be growing at least fast enough to keep up. And historically, broadly diversified, low-cost index funds, which simply track the overall market rather than trying to beat it, have been one of the most accessible ways for ordinary people to put their money to work in a way that can, over time, outpace inflation. Not as a guarantee, not as financial advice, as a concept worth understanding. The difference between money sitting still and money growing quietly in the background is not dramatic in any given month, but over years, over decades, it becomes one of the most significant financial differences in a person's life. And it starts with something simple: understanding that doing nothing is not neutral. Keeping money completely still is a choice. And like every financial choice, it has a cost. Most people just never calculated it because nobody encouraged them to. The invisible tax works best when it stays invisible. When people assume that responsible means safe, and safe means leaving money alone. When the gap between what inflation takes and what savings earn stays quietly in the background, never quite adding up to a number that feels alarming enough to act on. But now you can see it. And here is the shift that matters. Saving is still good. Saving is still essential. Nothing in this changes that. Building a savings account, maintaining an emergency fund, living below your means, all of that still matters. But saving alone, in the world we live in, is no longer enough to protect what you've built. The goal isn't to stop being careful. The goal is to understand what careful actually means now. It means knowing that money needs to move to stay healthy. It means understanding that preservation requires intention, not just restraint. It means recognizing that the quiet, boring habit of putting money somewhere it can grow, even slowly, even modestly, is one of the most powerful financial decisions an ordinary person can make. Not because it's exciting, because it's steady, because inflation doesn't take a year off, and the plan that works against it doesn't need to be complicated. It just needs to exist. So if your money has felt like it's doing less lately, if the same savings that felt meaningful a few years ago feel somehow smaller today, you're not imagining it. You didn't fail. You didn't make a mistake. You just encountered a force that works on everyone's money quietly and constantly, and you did it without anyone handing you a clear explanation of what was happening or why. Now you have one. Your money is worth less than it was last year. Not because of anything you did, because of something you can now see. And what you can see, you can plan for. That is where it starts. Not with a dramatic overhaul, not with a risky bet, just with a clearer picture of what your money is doing, and a quiet decision to make sure it's working at least as hard as the force that's working against it.